In the vast, untamed expanse of the North Atlantic, far off the rugged western coast of Scotland, lies a tiny, desolate archipelago known as the Flannan Isles. These 7 rocky outcrops, often battered by tempestuous storms and perpetually shrouded in a spectral mist, were in 1900 home to nothing but seabirds, sheep, and a single towering monument to human endeavor, the Flannan Isles lighthouse. This was the domain of the Sentinels of Silence, men whose purpose was to maintain a lonely vigil, guardians of the night in a place that truly felt like the edge of the world. The architecture of the lighthouse itself was a testament to boring and steadfast resilience. Rising majestically from the highest point of Eilean Mor, the largest of the islands, it was a pristine white cylinder of granite, 75 feet tall, capped by a lantern room of gleaming brass and polished glass. The sound of its very existence was the rhythmic roar of the Atlantic, a constant, deep rumble that permeated every stone and every moment of life within its walls. To live here was to accept a life at the edge of the world, where the only companions were the elements and the monotonous beat of the ocean's heart. The rhythmic isolation. For the 3 lighthouse keepers stationed at Flannan Isles, their lives were a study in rhythmic isolation. Their shifts were long, their tasks repetitive, and their contact with the outside world minimal. The relief vessel, the Hesperus, brought supplies and fresh keepers only once every few weeks, sometimes delayed by the unforgiving blue of the sea. The days were filled with boring and essential duties, cleaning the intricate mechanisms of the lamp, polishing the lenses until they gleamed like jewels, and meticulously maintaining every cog and lever of the rotating apparatus. The sound of the steady whir, the clockwork mechanism that turned the light, was a comforting, rhythmic pulse in the vast silence. Eilean Mor itself was a desolate beauty. Its slopes were covered in coarse grass, perpetually wet with sea spray, and dotted with the ancient ruins of St. Flannan's Chapel, a tiny spectral stone structure that hinted at an even older history of solitude. The island was a temporal pause, a place where time seemed to slow down, measured only by the rhythmic change of the tides and the whispering wind that constantly swept across its barren expanse. The keepers, in their heavy woolens, would walk the slippery paths, their boots making soft, rhythmic crunching sounds on the gravel, a rare break in the profound silence. The daily rhythms of the sentinels. The keepers' quarters were cozy, albeit boringly Spartan. A small common room with a roaring fire provided warmth against the rhythmic chill of the Atlantic. Here they would eat their simple, rhythmic meals, play cards, or read worn books brought from the mainland. The sound of the crackling fire was often the only counterpoint to the incessant roar of the wind and waves outside. These were the moments of human connection, brief and muted amidst the overwhelming scale of their isolation. Principal keeper James Duckett, a man of boringly firm resolve and vast experience, was the steady anchor of the team. His assistant, Thomas Marshall, was quieter, more introverted, finding solace in the rhythmic patterns of the sea. The 3rd keeper, Donald MacArthur, was known for his restless spirit and a tendency towards melancholy, a dangerous trait in such profound isolation. Together, they formed a mini-society, their lives intricately intertwined, their purpose singular, to keep the light burning. The light, a rhythmic flash every 30 seconds, was their connection to humanity, their siren song to passing ships. life at the edge of the world. The edge of the world was not just a geographical location, it was a state of mind. Days blurred into weeks, seasons into years. The keepers became intimately familiar with the rhythmic cycles of the sea, the gentle lull of calm weather, the threatening buildup of a gale, and the monstrous fury of a full-blown storm. The sound of the waves during a storm was not a roar, but a deep, rhythmic thud, as if the ocean itself was trying to hammer down the granite walls of their fortress. Their connection to the boring routines of the mainland was maintained through a rudimentary signal flag system used when the weather permitted the Hesperus to approach. It was a rhythmic dance of colors against the gray sky, a silent conversation across the unforgiving blue. But mostly they existed in a vacuum, their stories told only by the whispering wind and the rhythmic pulse of the powerful lamp. As November of 1900 drew to a close, a heavy calm had settled over the Flannan Isles, a boring and deep quiet that seemed to hold its breath. It was a deceptive peace, a temporal pause before the beginning of a mystery that would transform these sentinels of silence into the most enduring enigma of the Scottish seas. Inside the thick granite walls of the Flannan Isles lighthouse, life was governed by a rhythmic rotation that never faltered. For James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, time was not measured by the rise and fall of the sun, but by the duty of the three watchers. Their world was divided into 4-hour blocks, a perpetual cycle of waking and sleeping, of cleaning and watching. The sound of this existence was the muted click of the clockwork mechanism and the steady, rhythmic breathing of men who had grown comfortable with the deep silence of the Atlantic. This was the boring core of their lives, a series of rituals designed to keep the darkness at bay. The architecture of the watch was built on absolute precision. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the unforgiving blue of the horizon, the lantern had to be lit. This was a rhythmic ceremony. One keeper would climb the winding stone staircase, a steady, rhythmic clamber of boots on granite, carrying cans of oil. The lantern room, with its massive Fresnel lens, was a place of gleaming silence. The wick was trimmed with surgical care, the oil reservoir filled, and then, with a single match, the darkness was pushed back. The sound of the flame catching was a soft, rhythmic whoosh, followed by the steady whir of the rotation gears as the light began its 360-degree journey. The rhythmic labor of the lamp. Maintaining the light was a labor of boring and beautiful repetition. The lens, a masterpiece of glass and brass, required constant attention. The keepers would spend hours with soft cloths, engaging in the rhythmic polishing of the glass to ensure that not a single speck of dust or salt spray dimmed the beam. To a casual observer, this work would seem monotonous, but to the three watchers, it was their sacred duty. The light was a rhythmic pulse of hope for every sailor navigating the treacherous waters around Island Moor. It was the voice of the island, and as long as it turned, the world was in order. Outside the lantern room, the island demanded its own rhythmic labor. The landing stages, east and west, had to be kept clear of debris. The iron railings, constantly attacked by the corrosive salt air, needed the steady, rhythmic scrape of wire brushes and fresh coats of red lead paint. Donald MacArthur, often the most restless of the three, took to these outdoor tasks with a rhythmic intensity. The sound of his hammer against the iron was a lonesome percussion that echoed across the cliffs, a human sound trying to compete with the ancient roar of the sea. The psychology of the circle. The
The rhythmic rotation of their duties created a unique psychological state. In the boring and predictable environment of the lighthouse, the three men became like parts of a single machine. James Ducat was the rhythmic mind, calculating supplies and overseeing the logbook with a stoic calm. Thomas Marshall was the quiet hand, performing his tasks with a dreamlike fluidity. And MacArthur was the primal energy, his moods rising and falling like the unpredictable tides around them. They lived in an architecture of proximity, confined to small rooms, their conversations falling into rhythmic patterns that required few words. Their meals were the anchors of the day. In the small kitchen they would sit together, the rhythmic clink of spoons against ceramic bowls, the only music they needed. They spoke of boring things, the weather on the mainland, the health of their families in Edinburgh or the Hebrides, and the monotonous grace of the birds that nested on the cliffs. But beneath the surface of this rhythmic stability, the isolation was doing its work. The Atlantic was always there, a spectral presence pressing against the windows, a deep rhythmic hum that whispered of the fragility of their human routine. The duty of the three watchers. By the first week of December 1900, the duty of the three watchers had become a meditation. The rhythmic rotation had smoothed out the edges of their personalities. They moved through the lighthouse with a ghostly efficiency, their footsteps on the spiral stairs a rhythmic echo of the thousands of steps they had taken before. The light continued to flash, a steady rhythmic beacon every 30 seconds, cutting through the winter gloom. This was the height of the Sentinels' power. They were the masters of their rocky domain, keepers of a boring and vital flame. But the sea was preparing a rhythmic change. The atmosphere began to thicken with a spectral pressure, and the whispering wind took on a sharper, more rhythmic edge. The duty of the three watchers was about to be tested by an event that no amount of polishing or oiling could prepare them for. As the year 1900 drew towards its close, the rhythmic rotation was spinning towards its final silent revolution, leaving only the architecture of the light to witness what was coming from the dark, unforgiving blue. As December 1900 progressed, the atmosphere around Island Moor shifted from boringly predictable to something thick, heavy, and spectral. This chapter of the mystery is defined by the Logbook of Spectral Weather, a series of written entries that defy the reality of the world outside. While the lighthouse was built to withstand the rhythmic fury of the Atlantic, the logs suggest that the three keepers were facing a storm, not just of wind and rain, but of the mind. The sound of this period was the faint rhythmic scratching of a quill on paper, a lonely human sound trying to make sense of an unseen storm. The entries in the logbook began to veer away from the boring notations of wind speed and oil consumption. Thomas Marshall, who was responsible for the entries during this time, recorded weather that was monstrous in its intensity. He wrote of rhythmic gales so powerful that they shook the very foundation of the granite tower, a feat that seemed physically impossible given the lighthouse's engineering. But the true mystery lay in the spectral contrast. While the logbook spoke of a world-ending tempest, the official weather records from the mainland and passing ships reported the seas around the Flannan Isles as being boringly calm. The architecture of a psychological tempest. The Logbook of Spectral Weather serves as an architecture of the unseen. Marshall's writing described James Ducat, the veteran leader, as unusually quiet, and the tough, restless Donald MacArthur as crying. This was a rhythmic departure from their known characters. The sound of the lighthouse during these recorded hours was, according to the log, a symphony of terror. Yet if an observer had been standing on the shore, they would have seen only a muted rhythmic sea and a sky of dull, gray stillness. The keepers were trapped in a temporal vacuum. Inside the lighthouse, time was being measured by the rhythmic pulse of a storm that only they could hear. The unseen storm was a ghostly presence in the room, a pressure that weighed on their chests like the deep water of the Atlantic. The logbook entries became a rhythmic cry for a divine intervention that never came. Marshall's final recorded words, "God is over all," marked the end of the written history of the Flannan Isles. It was a boringly final sentence that left a spectral echo in the silence of the tower. The rhythmic distortion of reality. The logbook of spectral weather suggests a rhythmic distortion of reality. In the boring isolation of the edge of the world, the boundary between the internal and external often blurs. The sound of the unseen storm might have been the acoustic projection of their own mounting anxiety, the rhythmic hum of the wind through the ventilation shafts, transformed by their tired minds into the screams of a gale. This distortion created a spectral environment where the architecture of the lighthouse no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a gilded cage. The steady, rhythmic whir of the lantern gears, which had once been a source of comfort, now sounded like a countdown. Every rhythmic flash of the light was a reminder of the darkness that lay just beyond the glass. The unseen storm had isolated them, not just from the world, but from their own senses. The silence after the script. On December 15th, the logbook went silent. The rhythmic scratching of the quill stopped. There were no more entries about storms, no more prayers, and no more boring notations of oil. The logbook of spectral weather was closed, left on the table as a silent witness to whatever followed. The sound that replaced the writing was the absolute rhythmic silence of an abandoned house. Outside, the Atlantic continued its monotonous role, indifferent to the spectral drama that had unfolded within the granite walls. The unseen storm had passed, leaving behind a vacuum of certainty. The lighthouse stood as a spectral monument in the gray morning light, its lamp unlit, its keepers gone. The logbook of spectral weather remains one of the most chilling architectures of history, a record of a storm that existed only for 3 men in a place where the wind whispers secrets that the boring world was never meant to hear. On the night of December 15th, 1900, the steamer Arctur, making its way through the rhythmic choppiness of the North Atlantic toward Leith, encountered something that defied the boring expectations of maritime safety. As the ship approached the coordinates of Eilean Mor, the crew looked toward the horizon for the familiar, steady, rhythmic flash of the Flannan Isles lighthouse. But instead of the beacon that had guided them through the unforgiving blue for years, they found only a void of shadows. This was the dead light, a silent, dark tower standing as a spectral sentinel in a sea of total blackness. The sound of this discovery was the muted rattle of the ship's engines and the rhythmic hiss of the wake, sounds that seemed amplified by the absolute silence coming from the island. For a sailor, a lighthouse that does not light is more than a mechanical failure. It is a maritime omen. The encounter with darkness was a boringly terrifying realization that the architecture of safety had collapsed. The Arctur signaled the island, the rhythmic flare of its own lights searching for a response. But the Flannan Isles remained a silent stone giant, indifferent to the world passing by. the architecture of a missing pulse. The lighthouse was the heartbeat of the Hebrides, and on this night that heartbeat had stopped. The dead light created a spatial vacuum in the navigation of the Atlantic. Captain Holman of the Arctur noted the failure in his logs with a boringly stoic tone, yet the psychological weight of that darkness was heavy. The sound of the wind around the dark tower was imagined by the sailors as a low, rhythmic moan, a whispering warning that something had altered the daily rhythms of Eilean Mor. Inside the lantern room, the gleaming silence was now absolute. The massive Fresnel lens, which should have been a spinning galaxy of light, sat motionless. The rhythmic gears were still, the oil reservoirs cold. This architecture of darkness was a spectral contrast to the warmth and light the tower was built to provide. To any ship passing in the night, the island had become a black hole in the ocean, a place where the siren song of the light had been replaced by a symphony of absence. A ship's encounter with darkness. The Arctur did not stop. The boring reality of commercial shipping meant they had to push through the rhythmic gloom toward their destination. However, the report of the dead light was eventually passed to the Northern Lighthouse Board. This delay in reporting added to the temporal mystery. For several days, the Flannan Isles existed in a state of spectral limbo, a place where time had frozen and the duty of the watchers had been abandoned to the rhythmic dust. The encounter with darkness was not just a lack of light, it was a rhythmic signal that the human presence on the island had vanished. The sound of the ocean hitting the cliffs of Eilean Mor during those dark nights was a lonesome percussion, a boring and endless rhythm that no longer had a human audience. The whispering wind blew through the empty galleries of the lantern room, finding no one to hear its spectral secrets. The dead light was the first physical evidence that the sentinels of silence had truly become one with the silence they guarded. The rhythmic void. By the time the relief vessel Hesperus was prepared to investigate, the dead light had been dark for over a week. This boringly long duration meant that whatever had happened on the island had already settled into the architecture of history. The sound of the Hesperus's whistle as it finally approached the island on December 26th was a sharp rhythmic intrusion into a silence that had become solid. The discovery of the dead light changed the way the world looked at the Flannan Isles. It was no longer just a boringly reliable navigation point. It was a spectral landmark, a place where the rhythmic pulse of civilization had been snuffed out by an unseen force. As the rescuers prepared to land, they looked up at the dark glass of the lantern room, feeling the rhythmic shiver of a mystery that was just beginning to reveal its boring and terrifying depths. The encounter with darkness was over, but the architecture of abandonment was about to tell a story that would echo through the centuries.
When the relief vessel Hesperus finally arrived at Eilean Mor on December 26, 1900, the air was thick with a spectral stillness. The relief keeper, Joseph Moore, stepped onto the landing platform, his boots making a heavy rhythmic thud on the iron stairs that felt far too loud in the oppressive silence. He expected a boring greeting, perhaps a shout from the gallery or the sound of a door opening. Instead, he found an architecture of abandonment. The island was a stone shell, and as Moore ascended the steep path toward the lighthouse, the rhythmic sigh of the wind was the only voice that met him. As Moore entered the living quarters, he was struck by a scene that defined the boringly terrifying nature of the mystery. This was the dinner on the table, a temporal snapshot of a life interrupted. The kitchen was warm, or had been, with the muted smell of old cooking still clinging to the walls.
On the wooden table sat a meal that had never been finished. A chair was pushed back in a rhythmic hurry, as if its occupant had risen in a single sudden motion. The sound of Moore's own heartbeat became a rhythmic percussion as he realized that the sentinels of silence had left their wooden sanctuary in the middle of a mundane act. The rhythmic stillness of the domestic. The architecture of abandonment was not a scene of chaos. It was a scene of boring order that had been suddenly sucked dry of life. There were no broken dishes, no signs of a rhythmic struggle, and no blood. The pots on the stove were clean, and the rhythmic ticking of the clock had long since stopped, its spring wound down to a spectral halt. This was the most haunting aspect of the discovery, the lack of a reason. People do not leave a dinner on the table and vanish into the unforgiving blue without a catastrophic cause, yet the room felt peacefully empty. Moore moved through the bedrooms, finding the boring domesticity of the three men perfectly preserved. The beds were made with rhythmic precision, and the spare clothing was neatly folded. However, one detail stood out, a rhythmic clue left in the hallway. 2 sets of heavy oilskins and boots were missing, but the third set remained. This suggested that one man had left the lighthouse in a spectral hurry, perhaps without his protective gear, into the unseen storm. The sound of the wind rattling the door was a hollow, rhythmic knock, a reminder that the world outside was indifferent to the family of men who had once called this stone tower home. The architecture of a vanished life. The lighthouse itself was in boringly perfect condition. The rhythmic gears of the lantern were oiled, and the lamps were trimmed and ready to be lit. The architecture of abandonment was a paradox. The machine was ready to serve, but the operators had been erased. Moore and the search party explored every rhythmic corner of the island, calling out the names of Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur. Their voices were swallowed by the symphony of the Atlantic, returning to them as hollow echoes. On the west landing, they found further evidence of the unseen force. A supply box bolted to the rock 40 feet above sea level had been smashed, iron railings bent like rhythmic twigs. This suggested a giant wave, a rhythmic monster of water that had swept over the island. But why were the men down at the landing during a storm? And why was the dinner on the table left as if they expected to return in 5 minutes? The architecture of abandonment offered questions that pulsed with a rhythmic intensity, but it offered no final answers. The echoes of the empty table. By the time night fell, Joseph Moore had to light the lamp himself. The rhythmic flash returned to the Flannan Isles, but the watchers of the void were gone. Sitting in the kitchen by the dinner on the table, Joseph Moore felt the psychological mass of his missing comrades. The sound of the rhythmic creak of the tower became a spectral whisper, telling a story of a sudden, rhythmic departure into the dark. The architecture of abandonment became a spectral landmark in maritime history. It wasn't just the disappearance, it was the boring normalcy of the scene they left behind that captured the world's imagination. The dinner on the table remains a siren song for mystery seekers, a rhythmic reminder that life can be interrupted in the middle of a heartbeat. As the Hesperus prepared to carry the news back to the mainland, the Flannan Isles lighthouse stood tall, its light once again cutting through the unforgiving blue, guarding an island that had become a silent tomb of untouched dreams.
The Flannan Isles are not merely islands. They are the exposed tips of ancient, jagged mountains rising from the floor of the unforgiving Atlantic. Known to sailors as the Iron Coast, these cliffs are made of gneiss,
a stone so hard and boringly resilient that it has withstood millions of years of rhythmic pounding. However, even the hardest stone has an architecture of vulnerability. This chapter explores the physical reality of the disaster, focusing on the giant waves that haunt the North Atlantic, the rhythmic monsters that can appear from a clear horizon to reclaim anything standing at the edge of the world. The sound of the Iron Coast is a thunderous, rhythmic boom. When the Atlantic swells travel thousands of miles across the open, unforgiving blue and finally strike the cliffs of Island Moor, the impact is not a splash, it is an acoustic explosion. The vibration travels through the granite foundation of the lighthouse, a steady, rhythmic shudder that the keepers felt in their very bones. To live on the Iron Coast was to live inside a percussion instrument played by the hands of a giant. The giant waves were not just water, they were hydraulic hammers, capable of moving boulders weighing several tons as if they were boringly light pebbles. The architecture of a rogue wave. On the western side of the island, the cliffs drop vertically into the deep. This is the architecture of the abyss. During a rhythmic change in weather, the sea here can produce what oceanographers call rogue waves, giant waves that are twice the size of the surrounding swells. The sound of a rogue wave approaching is a deep, rhythmic hiss that grows into a screaming roar. It is a spectral force that defies the logic of a boring sea. When the investigators looked at the West Landing, they saw the rhythmic destruction left by such a force. A heavy iron crate, bolted into the rock way above the high tide mark, had been ripped clean from its moorings. The iron railings were twisted into spectral spirals. The unforgiving Atlantic had reached up with a giant, rhythmic hand and swept the landing clean. This provides the most boringly logical explanation. The men were at the landing, perhaps trying to secure equipment during a rhythmic surge, and were simply erased from the rock by a wall of water that left no trace behind. The unforgiving Atlantic is a rhythmic predator. It does not attack with anger, it attacks with boring indifference. The Iron Coast is littered with the spectral ribs of ships that underestimated the rhythmic power of the currents. For the three keepers, the sea was their provider and their jailer. The sound of the water retreating from the cliffs after a strike is a sibilant rhythmic suck, a sound of empty consumption. If a giant wave had indeed taken the men, the architecture of the event would have been instantaneous. There would be no rhythmic struggle, no time for a siren cry. One moment, three men were standing on the Iron Coast, performing their boring duty, and the next, they were part of the unforgiving blue. The ocean does not leave rhythmic clues, it only leaves absence. This theory explains the architecture of abandonment found in the lighthouse, the hurried exit, the missing oilskins, and the dinner on the table. They saw the giant monster coming, or went to face it, and the Iron Coast claimed its toll. The rhythmic echo of the deep. Even today, the Iron Coast remains a place of spectral power. Modern lighthouse keepers, before automation, spoke of the rhythmic dread they felt when the Atlantic turned a certain shade of dark slate. The giant waves still haunt the Flannan Isles, their thunderous pulse a constant reminder of the vanishing truth of 1900. The sound of the sea hitting the gneiss is a boringly eternal sound, a rhythm that existed before the lighthouse and will exist long after it has crumbled into spectral dust. The unforgiving Atlantic did more than take 3 lives. It created a rhythmic mystery that anchors the Flannan Isles in the architecture of the unknown. The Iron Coast is the silent witness, its jagged rocks holding the secrets of the giant waves in a stone-cold silence. As the whispering wind carries the salt spray over the cliffs, it sings a song of deep, rhythmic loss, a tribute to the sentinels of silence who were claimed by the very power they spent their lives trying to warn others against. The sea has no memory, only a rhythmic hunger that never lands.
The lighthouse on Island Moor still stands, a boringly stoic pillar of white stone against the charcoal sky of the North Atlantic. But since that cold December in 1900, it has been a place of echoes in the mist. The mystery of the 3 missing men was never solved by a courtroom or a scientist. Instead, it was absorbed into the architecture of the Eternal Watch. Today, the light is automated, controlled by rhythmic computers and distant satellites, but those who visit the island still claim to hear the muted footsteps of the sentinels who never truly left their post. This is the postscript of a vanishing, a story that stays forever at sea. The sound of the Eternal Watch is a gentle rhythmic hum. It is the sound of the wind passing through the iron railings and the sibilant whisper of the mist as it clings to the granite. For over a century, the Flannan Isles have been a temporal anchor for ghost stories and spectral theories. Did the men fall victim to a rhythmic madness brought on by isolation, or did they sail away on a ghostly vessel that only appears when the fog is thickest? These questions are the echoes in the mist. They offer no answers, only a boringly beautiful layer of mystery to the unforgiving blue. The architecture of memory. In the years following the disappearance, the Flannan Isles lighthouse became a site of spectral pilgrimage for those fascinated by the architecture of the unknown. New keepers who were stationed there spoke of a rhythmic heaviness in the air, especially in the kitchen, where the dinner on the table had once sat. They spoke of the spectral scent of tobacco smoke when no one was smoking, and the boringly regular sound of a door latch clicking when the wind was still. These were not ghosts of terror, but ghosts of routine, the sentinels of silence continuing their eternal watch in the afterlife of history. The postscript of the Flannan Isles is written in the rhythmic persistence of the light itself. Every 30 seconds, the rhythmic flash still cuts through the darkness, a mechanical pulse that honors the men who kept it burning until the very end. The sound of the rotating lens is a spectral lullaby, a reminder that while humans are fragile and fleet, the duties we perform can take on a life of their own. The architecture of the lighthouse has become a monument to the missing, a white gravestone for 3 men whose only cemetery is the endless rhythmic Atlantic. Echoes in the mist and the final lull. As we reach the end of this whispered history, the Flannan Isles fade back into the spectral fog of the past. The rhythmic roar of the sea continues, a boring and eternal symphony that requires no audience. The Eternal Watch is a reminder that there are places in this world where the architecture of logic fails, and all that remains is the siren song of the mystery. The 3 watchers, Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur, have become part of the rhythmic breath of the ocean, their names etched into the spectral gneiss of the Iron Coast. The postscript to their story is one of deep unsolved peace.
There is a certain comfort in the vanishing truth, the idea that some things are meant to be lost to the unforgiving blue. As you listen to the rhythmic hiss of the waves in your mind, let the mystery of the Flannan Isles act as a spectral blanket. The light is burning, the rhythmic rotation is steady, and the island is at rest. The sentinels of silence have finished their shift, leaving the world to sleep in the boringly grand shadow of their eternal watch. The symphony's final revolution. The whispering wind of Island Moor now carries only the rhythmic echoes of the birds and the sea. The architecture of abandonment has been replaced by the architecture of automation, yet the spectral heart of the island still beats. The story of the Watchers of the Void is a rhythmic loop that never ends, a boring history that keeps us anchored to the mysteries of the deep. As the spectral mist closes in one last time, we leave the lighthouse to its rhythmic vigil. The postscript is silence. The echoes in the mist are hushed. The eternal watch continues, forever silent, forever still, in the heart of the unforgiving, rhythmic blue.